So we're Baruch Hashem, we're going to prepare for the holiday of Shavuos by studying together the book of Ruth. Today we're studying, or our Torah study today is in this whole week is in memory of our friend Tom Sachs, who is passed away. His yahrzeit is Tuesday night, and so we have him in mind. And we're Tuvia Ben Yitzchak also. It's all the Torah today study tomorrow is in memory of Lorraine Ray, Bruce Ray's mother. Also, since I see Wendy on Zoom, I'd like to point out that I encouraged everybody in the yeshiva this past Shabbos to send a thank you note to the King of England because he went out of his way to be supportive of the Jewish people, and it's an obligation from the Torah to express gratitude. So he went out of his way to be a friend to the Jews. So we should all write him an email expressing thank you to the king for his strong show of support. He walked around Golders Green with two chalus in his hands. Baruch Hashem. So what I'd like to talk about today is basically study with everybody the introduction to the. See, Jill is on. Jill, we just mentioned your husband's name because we said we're studying Torah this week in his memory, Tuvia Ben Yitzchak. So thank you, Jill,
Thank
and
you.
thank you for sponsoring. And if anybody wants to eat anything delicious, only if you want to eat something delicious, come to the yeshiva this Shabbos, the second day of Shavuos, when we're uh, going to have delicious challah that Jill makes. Also, Thursday night, we're going to have a meal at the yeshiva if anybody wants to join us. And we're going to have, well, we might have Jill challah then too. We have to see how to break it up. But we're definitely going to have it on Shabbos morning at our Kiddush. So what I'd like to study with everybody is the introduction to the book of Ruth as written by Feivel Meltzer in the commentary called the Dat Mikra, which is a beautiful edition of the of the Tanakh, and by the Musar book edition. Okay, so now let us. The first thing that he asks is why was this scroll written? Um, so the Midrash says at the Midrash Ruth Rabbah, and I have a feeling that Shana, if anybody wants to see, some people asked for the sources for Shana Winter's class later. I'll email it to whoever wants to see it. If you ask me, send me a message afterwards. I'll email you the sources so you could study them. This Midrash states, Megillah Zu Ein Ba Lo Tuma V'Lo Tahara. This book of Ruth, this scroll doesn't have Tuma or Tahara or Isser V'Lo. It doesn't have halachot in it. It doesn't have law. It doesn't tell us what's permitted, what's prohibited, what's ritually pure and what's impure. It doesn't, you won't find anything from the book of Vayikra in this law or the book of Midbar, or Devarim. You won't find it here. Lama Nechtava. Why was this book written? So the book was written, says the Midrash, just to teach us this fundamental idea of the reward for those who practice kindness. Because Ruth, in fact, is the paradigm of the person who just gives and gives in a very generous manner and asks nothing in return. And in that context, she was rewarded in this world and in the next world. She was rewarded in this world by her marriage to Boaz and her birth of a child. And in the next world, because she was the mother of kings, as David descended from her. So the Midrash is telling us that the book as a whole, is here to teach us an overarching message, which is a message of kindness. Even though there are certain mitzvot which are written in this book. So, nevertheless, there are other theories about why it was written, aside from this concept of kindness. So, some want to suggest that the book of Ruth is a polemic opposite. It was written in the time, some want to suggest that it was written in the time of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And what happened at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah is when Ezra and Nehemiah came back from Babylon, there were many of the Jews who had married into the women of other faiths, and especially the Moabite woman. And so therefore, some read this as a polemic against the approach of Ezra and Nehemiah, which was to kick out those women from the community, those Moabite women. And according to this approach, the book of Ruth is telling us, don't act so stringently against these women, because these women were actually very good. Look at Ruth. She was such a paragon. So that's his theory. That's what some want to suggest, that the book was promoting intermarriage. But already you could suggest that the book could actually prove the exact opposite, as Mordechai pointed out to me last night in our discussion, that the names of Machon and Chilion, who are the two husbands of Ruth and Orpah, they were punished and they died. Maybe precisely they died because they married Ruth and Orpah, who were Moabite women. So therefore, you can't prove that it's all good to marry Moabite women from this book. And furthermore, Ruth is not the paradigm of the Moabite woman. She's the exception. But she had to leave her community and join the Jewish people. So she became a righteous convert. Furthermore, this book is the opposite of a polemic, because this book is all about tranquility and peace and harmony, and the book does not support this concept of a polemical struggle. I mean, you would expect the polemic to throw some zingers, and this book has no zingers in it. It's, of all the books in the Bible, like the sweetest, the kindest, the most generous of all. So another approach is that the purpose of the Megillah, this is one of the most popular approaches, is to support the lineage, or to tell over the lineage of King David. And this is logical. One of the reasons why this is so logical is that the book concludes by going through the lineage of David and telling us the last sentence is that Yishai gave birth to David. So that's how the book ends. And it also counts 10 generations from Peretz, who was the son of Tamar, until David. And so therefore we have a statement in the Zohar. The Zohar states, Amar Rabbi Yosei ben Kisma, Tama ani Megillah zu loba el Yachai zera shel David. He says, the whole purpose of this book is to tell us where King David comes from. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yosef says, to prove that the seed of David, and David is pure, refined silver. So it's to show us that David comes from the best of the best. That's a reason why we read this on Shavuot, according to that theory, because King David himself was both born and died on Shavuot. So therefore it makes sense to read it. Another possibility is that the reason why we need to tell about the lineage of David was to convince those who were against David. The Gemara itself refers to this. The Gemara itself refers to the fact that people were saying, you can't marry you're not that they, not only can David not be king, he's not even Jewish. The Gemara challenged David's lineage by saying he didn't come from the he didn't come from amongst the Jewish people. This is the Talmud in Yevamot 76b says that Doeg Hadomi said to Shaul, before you ask me if King David can be king, ask about him if he's able to even marry amongst the Jews. Meaning to say that there were people, a contemporary of David, who was, according to the Talmud, who were challenging David's ability to marry amongst the Jews. And so therefore, this book draws a lineage and showing that King David himself goes back all the way to Judah. Therefore, he's a blue blood on one side, directly all the way back to Nachshon and Peretz and Judah himself. And his father was a Gibor Chayil. And also, not only that, the book praises Ruth herself, David's grandmother, as being an Eshet Chayil. Or David's, hold on, let me look here. David's, David's great grandmother. Okay, so we see from here that the book is really giving a lot of prestige to where David comes from, and that's the power of prestige. Nevertheless, we can also, we're bothered by the fact because there is something to be said for what Doeg was saying, because Doeg said, listen, he comes from a Moabite. That's not exactly a Moabitess. That's not exactly, I mean, today we don't really care so much if somebody goes back like 4 generations and the lineage is suspect 4 generations back. But you could imagine this is the king of Israel, and the Moabites were the people you weren't allowed to marry in. And not only that, if you go back, even not only are you not allowed to marry into them, if you look at Deuteronomy, it says you can't seek out their welfare and you can't do good for them. You're not allowed to do anything good for them. Not only that, if you go back even further, where do the Moabites come from? And they come from the union of Lot and his daughters, which is a union that created a mamzer. So if that's the case, we can suggest that maybe the purpose is not to give the lineage of David, because if the purpose was to give the lineage of David, they wouldn't have focused so much on Ruth. They would have focused more on the other characters in the book. And this book is really not about the origin story of David as much as it is about the origin story of Ruth, and which is the central part of this book. And so therefore, it's more, rather than saying the purpose of this book was to tell us about how David was born, it's more likely to say that the purpose of this book is to show us what comes as a reward for Ruth's tremendous kindness. And that is the Mashiach. David is the father of the Mashiach. So as a reward for David's tremendous kindness comes the Mashiach. So therefore, we go back to the source we cited at the beginning. Now, what's the reason for the writing of this book? The reason for the writing of this book is not to teach us any specific halachot, although there are some laws, and not to get involved in an ancient polemic, but rather it's to teach us a basic rule of life, and that is the obligation to act with kindness towards others. The obligation to act with kindness to others. Let's go through let's go through some examples of where this book demonstrates kindness. So first of all, we see that the poor people were given gifts. That Naomi told Ruth, "Go out and collect in the field," and so Ruth, even though she was a convert and a widow and poor, she was still treated generously. And furthermore, Boaz is specifically told the people who were around her to make sure that she got food. But this is not necessarily what Rebbe Zeira was focusing on, because this is a literal law that doesn't go beyond the law. So the question is, let's focus on those aspects, which Maimonides calls kindness is somebody who acts beyond what he's required. Meaning to say, giving charity is not necessarily called chesed, because that's our obligation. Chesed, kindness, is when one goes beyond charity. And so therefore, chesed is something that's done beyond the charity. So, for example, when in the story, when Ruth clung to Naomi and escorted her mother-in-law back after her mother-in-law was widowed and destitute, that's beyond the letter of the law, because she was certainly not obligated to go back and care for her mother-in-law at that point. Furthermore, the idea is that Ruth showed both the kindness to both the deceased and the living. And we know that the kindness to the dead is the ultimate kindness, because there's no way to being paid back for that. So this is another example of Ruth's kindness. Furthermore, the fact that Ruth was willing to humiliate herself and go into the field and collect on behalf of her mother was another act of kindness that she did to care for her mother. Because Ruth really could have married anybody at that point. She wasn't bound to marry her. There was nobody who she was required to marry, but she did this only to help her mother, to help her deceased husband to have a seed. And so therefore she married one of his relatives. The book makes the theme that if you do acts of kindness, you'll be rewarded for them. And if you do acts of stinginess, you'll be punished. So Ruth, who did an act of kindness many times, acted generously. So she was rewarded generously by Boaz and by God with a child, and by Boaz with food and with marriage. Whereas in the contrast, Elimelech and his family, who acted with stinginess, they benefited by the fact they were punished in that they died, and Machon and Cholion died, and Nami had to go back empty-handed. But when she went back empty-handed, she was rewarded with the kingdom. It's important to make this point that the book highlights the divine providence about everything happened according to a divine plan in arranging for David to take on the mantle of the Messiah. That it says she came. Here are some examples of the divine plan that Ruth came to the field that belonged to Boaz by chance, and also Boaz happened to be the one who was the relative. So, and then she became pregnant. Actually, according to the Midrash, she became pregnant with Boaz's child, and Boaz died that same night. The Midrash states, and this is a beautiful expression to remember, Boaz asat shalom. Boaz did what his responsibility was, and Ruth did what her responsibility was, and Naomi did her responsibility. So God says, since you are all doing your responsibilities, I will do my responsibility as well, and I will arrange everything to happen. So basically, according to this approach, the fundamental message of this book is that if we act in a way of kindness and giving and generosity, Hashem will reward us. And that's why, as a result of the way Ruth acted, that she inspired Boaz to act in this manner, and Naomi, and all this just paying it forward acts of kindness caused eventually the birth of the Mashiach, the birth of David. So if we want to benefit, if we want to bring about the Mashiach, then we have to do our job, and our job is to act with kindness. Okay, so now let's talk about, as a general principle, the mitzvot of the Torah that appear in the book of Ruth, and then we can talk about who wrote the book of Ruth. Okay, so, or should we talk about first why we read this book? Let's first talk about why we read this book on Shavuot. Why do we read this book on Shavuot? So there are many answers that are suggested for this. And as a general rule, if there are many answers, that means there isn't one clear, obvious answer. Because nobody says why we read the book of Esther on Purim. Obviously, we read the book of Esther on Purim. It's not even a question. Nobody says why do we read the book of Eicha on Tisha B'Av. Obviously, we read the book of Lamentations on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is about the destruction of the temple, and so Eicha is lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. And now we get to why do we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, and really, it's not so clear. So, so there's a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of reasons given, and we'll suggest some of them. The earliest sources for the idea that the book of Ruth is read on Shavuot goes back to the period of the Gaonim, meaning to the 7th and 8th century. The Yalkut Shimoni Midrash Ruth Zuta says, "Ma inyan Ruth etzel atzeres shenikres b'atzeres." Talks about why is Ruth read on Shavuot. So this is a very ancient custom. This is about as old as a custom can be without being in the Talmud. So the hold on. I'm going to suggest six possible reasons why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. One reason is, the most obvious reason, is because the book starts at the beginning of the barley harvest and it ends at the end of the wheat harvest, and that is a reflection of the period of year we're in now. That the Pesach starts at the beginning of the barley harvest. On the second day of the holiday of Pesach, we start the barley harvest. And Shavuot is the culmination of the wheat harvest. So, and immediately on Shavuot, we bring the 2 loaves of bread, which is the first offering of wheat brought in the temple. And these mitzvot appear in the book of Ruth, that he tells her to gather up the crops. So you see that they're gathering up the gleanings, that this is a period of the year, which is the harvest period. And so therefore, that makes perfect sense. Another explanation is, the second explanation is because Ruth converted or she joined the Jewish people. And Shavuot is the holiday where the Jewish people where we celebrate the acceptance of the Torah. And so therefore there's that same connection. A third thing is that the Torah, it says in the Midrash, was given that the Megillah is read on Shavuot, which is the time of the giving of the Torah, because the Megillah teaches us about the ordeals, the struggles that Ruth went through in order to join Am Yisrael, and it was a very hard journey. She was destitute, her husband died, she was humiliated, and that teaches us that Torah is acquired only through afflictions and poverty. Number 4, since this Megillah is entirely called Chesed, this Megillah is considered to be all kindness. And the Torah is also all kindness. As it states in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 26, Torah's chesed al lashona, the Torah of kindness on her tongue. Therefore, the Torah was given on the holiday of Shavuos. So therefore, this book reflects the main value of the Torah, which is kindness. The fifth explanation is one I already referred to, which is that since David was born on the holiday of Shavuos, and also he died, therefore the Megillah of Ruth teaches us about the lineage of David. And the sixth explanation, and this is the last one that we're going over, is to tell us that it was instituted in the Gaonic period as a polemic against the Karaites and maybe the early Christians who challenged our version of the oral law. And this is coming to support the oral law because they said that they only followed the written law, but in the oral law, it justifies how David was able to be a descendant of Moabite, because we said that it says in the Torah you're not allowed to marry a Moabite, but the oral law, the Talmud says you can only not marry. Remember that I cited the Gemara from Yevamos, the Gemara in Yevamos. What did I do? The Gemara in Yevamos. Hold on, I already forgot the page. Hold on. Where is the page in Yevamos? 76b. It states that it says a male Moabite cannot enter, but a female can. So these are the six explanations, the six classical explanations about the time of the year, either having to do with the Torah when it was given, or having to do with the fact that David was born, or the oral law's justification for David's being allowed to marry in. Some say that Ruth is another explanation is that Ruth has a numerical value of 606. The gematria Ruth, Resh is 200, Taf is 400, Vav is 6, and so therefore there are 606 commandments, but there are 613 commandments. So if you have 606 plus the 7 Noahide commandments that are before the Matan Torah, this teaches us that on Shavuot, just that the Jewish people accepted all 613 commandments like Ruth. So that these are some of the concepts. Okay, so these are some of the reasons why we read the book of Ruth. There's different customs, whether or not you have to read it from a parchment or whether you could read it from just like your printed book. When I was at OF, we used to read it from the parchment. But now we don't. We could easily start that again, but I haven't done that. I did write the book of Ruth one time, and I gave that as a gift to my friend Maharat Ruth. So I did write the book of Ruth. Okay, so what are some of the mitzvot that are mentioned in this book. What are some of the mitzvot that are mentioned? So there's really four main mitzvot that are mentioned, four categories of mitzvot. The first is the gifts to the poor, the matanot aniyim. These mitzvot are leket, the gleanings, that if there's a crop that's not really grown, it's called, they have to leave that there, that you wasn't picked, you leave it there for the poor. Also, shechacha, that let's say you forgot something in the field, if it's just one bundle, you can't go back for it. This is the only mitzvah you could do by forgetting. You can't intentionally, but if you forgot it, and peya, the corner of the field, you have to leave this for the ani and the ger, the poor and the foreigner, the widow and the orphan. Ruth was all of those. So she was poor, she was a foreigner, she was a widow. And so these are the concept of the gifts to the poor. The second mitzvah to focus on is the mitzvah of levirate marriage. This is very tricky because it's not directly here, but it's hinted to here. And the phrase yibum is what's called levirate marriage. On a biblical level, what is levirate marriage? On a biblical level, it refers to a very specific situation, which is, and only that specific situation, which is that a man, generally speaking, is never allowed to marry his brother's wife. Generally speaking, if his brother dies, he's not allowed to marry his brother's wife. Not allowed, prohibited. But that's if his brother dies and he has no children. But let's say his brother dies, that's if his brother dies and he has children. But if his brother dies without any children, if his brother was married to a woman who died without any children, then in biblical times, the ceremony of Yibum had to be performed, which is that the brother who was alive had to take his brother's widow in marriage, as levirate marriage. It's called levirate marriage in order to keep his brother's seed alive. The Bible also has a ceremony in case the brother did not want to do this yibum, and that was called chalitza, where the widow would remove the shoe of the brother, one of the brothers, and remove his shoe and spit on the ground and say, "Thus shall be done to the man who does not want to uphold the name of his brother." Meaning to say, the ideal way to do it was the yibum in biblical times and not the chalitza ceremony. The woman would not be able to remarry until she had this chalitza ceremony done, or the yibum. So this is biblical times, and the Bible favored yibum because, or else, what would happen to this woman? The widow, she would be left on her own, no support, nobody caring for her, and she would be abandoned like a beggar on the streets, a very, very precarious position. So the only humane thing to do was to marry, was for the surviving brother to marry his brother's widow. But what happened was, as biblical times progressed, as we moved forward in history, this became something that the purity of it was lost. And so already in the time of the Talmud, there are opinions that said that you should never ever do yibum anymore. You should never actually marry your brother's widow. You should always do this ceremony called chalitza, which is a divorce. And in fact, the rabbis didn't allow it. They stopped allowing it, although there were some unusual cases throughout history, but as a general rule, it was not allowed, and nobody would be allowed to do yibum anymore today. Nobody would be allowed to do this. So this is the ceremony called yibum. But how is that related to our book? Ruth's husband's brother was also dead. So there was no actual yibum. So nevertheless, there are some phrases in this book that are similar to the expression, to the language of Yibum. Because it says in chapter 4 of Ruth, in verse 5 and 10, it says that Boaz wants to marry, he's looking for somebody to marry Ruth to uphold the name of the deceased on his inheritance. It's clear from the conclusion of the story that Boaz is saying that you get Elimelech's fields if you marry Ruth. If you marry Ruth, you'll get the fields, which is a mixed bag because they wanted the fields, but they didn't want to marry Ruth either because she was a Moabitess woman, or because she was a burden, or because she was bad luck because her husband had died. So that was the idea that Boaz was saying, you have to marry her to uphold the name of your brother. Also, and this is similar to the words of Deuteronomy, which when it discusses the Yibum ceremony says, you should marry your brother's wife so that the name of the deceased is not cut off from amongst his brothers. Also, similarly to what the Chalitza ceremony is what happened here when it states that Boaz gathered at the gates of the city and he removed his shoe, and that's what was done in that time. And that was similar to what was going on over here as well, that removal of the shoe. I should note with our discussion here that this is a very, very painful conversation to have today. The reason is because it used to be that the Chalitza ceremony was very rare. I mean, in my rabbinate, I only came across it twice. But then after October 7th, tragically, there were many, many people who went straight from the chuppah to the battlefield. And so there were, unfortunately, too many cases of women who required chalitza because they were newly married and their husbands died without any children. And so therefore they had to do this chalitza ceremony with their husband's brothers. And one of the widows who participated in this told me it was the most awful experience, a horrible experience that she had to undergo, that she was just like devastated by having to relive the trauma of the death with these rabbis. And so this chalitza ceremony became very, very challenging in modern Israel today because it's very prevalent. Unfortunately, tragically, it's very prevalent. Okay, a third mitzvah, which is discussed in our book, is the mitzvah of geula, of redemption. Actually, we had that not this past Shabbos, but the Shabbos before in Parashas Bechukosai. We're told, or that if your brother will be poor and you sell his field, and the relative will come to and he wants to redeem the brother who was sold into bondage, or to redeem his fields that were sold. This is called the mitzvah of redemption, the mitzvah of geula. So this expression of geula, of an obligation to redeem, this is something that's talked about by Boaz here. He says, who wants to fulfill the mitzvah of redemption by redeeming Ruth or redeeming the fields of Elimelech, which have been abandoned? And the way you do that is by marrying the widow and thereby keeping the name or the manor alive. And so therefore, we have this expression of redemption, which parallels the expression of redemption that's found in the end of the book of Vayikra. And the fourth mitzvah, which is talked about in this book, is the mitzvah of, or the prohibition of marrying a Ammonite or Moabite. And as I said earlier, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they came as a direct descendants of the lineage of Lot and his daughters. And the Torah tells us that you're not allowed to marry into them because they were not kind to the Jewish people when the Jewish people left Egypt. Yet, we have in our case that Ruth is a Moabite. Not only does he marry her, but also she becomes the mother of David. So this prohibition is not explicitly in the text, but it does seem to be why the person, the Ploni Ammoni, the closer relative, doesn't want to marry. Because he says he does not want to destroy his seed. He didn't want to marry out. That would be destroying his seed. So it says, and also from the fact that the book emphasizes Ruth's ancestry as being Ruth the Moabite, keeps emphasizing that she doesn't fit into the society. Not only does she not fit in, there was legal challenges to Boaz marrying her. So, furthermore, the people said, Hazot Naami, when they see Naomi returning, but they don't mention anything about Ruth. So this idea of whether or not he was allowed to marry her, the Talmud says, as I mentioned earlier in Yevamot 76b, that Boaz taught them, but this, even in the time of the Talmud, this wasn't necessarily accepted, that she was really allowed to marry, that Ruth was, that this verse was only prohibiting, it says, it was only prohibiting males. It wasn't necessarily the case because nobody knew that halacha. If this was really an accepted law, nobody knew it until Boaz came along. So this shows it was extremely complicated. But therefore, this is about the triumph of the oral law. Okay, so yes, and we'll stop here. We'll take some questions, of course. I just want to say that we're in the middle. We'll have to continue this on Wednesday by going through when the book of Ruth was written and who wrote the book of Ruth and some Ruth and halacha. So we have a lot more to go here.